seeing us downstairs.
You're not seeing us?
Put something up to put it back in.
Oh, you can switch to the slate.
I have to put this up so it's easier for the finders. There's a lot of slates they'd be switching for, you know.
Okay.
Let's let that up for now. I'll put it back on.
All right.
Once they get us.
I like it.
Oh, no.
Okay. Do you want a donut or anything?
Oh, okay. I'll go through the cameras real quick here. Here's one. Here's two. Back to the door. That thing switching? Really? I'm not even sending the door. Right now, I'm not even sending the door. Yeah. I changed to a shot of a chair now. Yeah. Okay. So there's two. Yeah. There's one. There's two, and then back to the door. One, two. Yeah, it looks fine up here. I mean, it's switching. Okay. Okay, here's one, two, three.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed that before. That's nice.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I'll turn that off now then. Okay. What you get? Okay. Okay, right now we're on the doorway. Here's one. Two.
No, I think it's fine.
Back to the door. Okay, I'm gonna switch it here. Here's camera two. Now still on the door. All right, now. How about now? Still on the door. Okay, now I have it. Stick on the door.
What are you doing? Oh, okay.
Okay. I'll sit down and call you back in a few minutes.
Yes, yeah. Nothing's really changed. We do have a few more portraits on the wall. Sound check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Budget committee hearing room. You good? This is budget committee hearing room, 210 Cannon.
Thank you.
Don't let him confuse you.
I left, I updated, hers changed the, only two
Okay.
It's only 2 pages. I think it matches.
Right.
Does it? Because we're closing Posner instead of Joyce. He switched us to.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because he wants to be down here anyway, so.
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna sit here. I don't know where Paul's planning to sit.
Oh, yeah, he'll be
He's
down
in
there.
com-
Why don't you come over here, Jay? Okay.
Thanks, John. That sounds good. Awesome. for, they didn't think about it just with the time sensitivity of getting him on the committee to get markup.
They probably figured, well, we'll let them figure it out.
Yeah. When in all reality, it is their fault.
Well, it's going. Good, that's the right answer.
He switched the order. He switched Posner.
But they like it.
He read all of the
Different voice from
testing. Yeah. I think the script is right this time. It's just laugh. What?
No one answered. Yeah. Well,
Romito, you're killing me.
well, yeah, I did. No, I didn't see there, neither was I. Okay, well, I'll see.
This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome folks to the Budget Committee hearing on entitled First Principles of Congressional Budgeting. I want to thank everyone for their attendance today and those joining us. We called today's hearing to discuss the congressional budget process, and I told folks that that doesn't create enthusiasm and excitement in a lot of individuals, but it does for those of us who love budgeting and understand and appreciate that it has far greater consequences than some might think. I'd venture to guess that the American people are probably not all too familiar with the specifics of this issue, and that's understandable. But I believe, and this hearing will hopefully show, that the manner by which and the rules under which Congress puts together a budget are incredibly important to not only the fiscal health of our nation, but the health and vitality of, indeed, our constitutional system itself. The congressional budget process is broken. There's general consensus on that. It's outdated. It's been 40 years since the rules were written. Suffice to say that our world has changed dramatically. What has not changed, unfortunately, is the habit in Washington of spending beyond our means. The current budget process is not only ill-equipped to help policymakers be more fiscally responsible, it reinforces bad spending habits. The default is always to spend more when we know that more money is not always or often the right solution. The current budget process is also not particularly good at forcing Congress to do its job. This year was the first time since 2001 that the House and Senate had passed a joint 10-year balanced budget agreement. When Congress ignores its budget responsibilities, it's forfeiting the power of the purse, which we all know is not just about dollars and cents. The Constitution gave Congress this authority so that the people's elected representatives could hold government accountable, to ensure robust and legitimate oversight of the bureaucracy and, when necessary, eliminate ineffective and inefficient policies and programs. As Madison wrote, this power of the purse may, in fact, be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. No one would argue that creating a budget is a simple task, especially when Washington spends $3.5 trillion a year. We can make small changes here and there that will help enhance Congress's authority in this area. But when dealing with a process that was created before a lot of people in this room were even born, it's time to start thinking about a better way to do things. As former CBO Director Alice Rivlin said just a few years ago, the time for incremental reforms of the budget process is over. The Congress should blow it up and start over from first principles. So what might those principles look like? First, we should be exercising constitutional control. The Founding Fathers explicitly gave Congress the power of the purse, and we need to have a better sense of respect for that duty when it comes to taxes and spending. This, in turn, will help correct the shift in balance of powers and help pull back the overreach of the executive branch for both Republican and Democratic administrations. Second is promoting fiscal responsibility. As I mentioned at the beginning, the current process reinforces a bias toward higher spending without sufficient rules or guidelines in place to align spending with anything resembling a sustainable outlook. A smarter process would incentivize more responsible fiscal choices. Third, we must increase our oversight. Waste and fraud and abuse exist all throughout the federal government, and too much spending is simply set on autopilot. We need to regularly review our spending habits so that we can fix mistakes and make improvements where needed. And fourth and finally, we need a better understanding of how much programs cost. We need to continue to strengthen our nonpartisan fiscal analysis to gain stronger insight into how policies affect the economy and the federal budget. With more information, Congress should be able to make better decisions. A better budget process is achievable, and by adhering to common sense principles such as these, we can begin to spend tax dollars more efficiently and effectively. That's why it's so important we're having this conversation here today, and I'm so pleased to welcome all of our witnesses. We have Dr. David Primo, an associate professor at the University of Rochester and a senior scholar at the Mercatus Center at George Washington University. Dr. Philip Joyce is a professor of public policy and senior associate dean at the University of Maryland's School of Public Policy. Ms. Carmel Martin is the executive vice president for policy at the Center for American Progress. And Mr. Paul Posner is the director of the Graduate Public Administration Program at George Mason University. We want to welcome all of you. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. I look forward to an enlightening conversation about how we fix our congressional budget process and ensure hard-earned taxpayer dollars are spent in a more responsible and accountable manner. I want to thank you so very much for joining us and all the members who are with us today, and I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join the chairman in welcoming all the witnesses today. And we all agree that we have long-term budget challenges, but I would argue strongly that the solution to that challenge is not primarily through changes to the budget process rules. It's much more a matter of political will and a willingness of the parties to come to agreement for the good of the country. What we should be talking about today is the urgent need to grow our economy with more broadly shared prosperity, which is the most effective way to reduce the deficit. That effort should begin with immediate negotiations to replace the damaging sequester cuts that the Congressional Budget Office say will be a drag on the economy over the next few years, and avoid the threat of a government shutdown, which is once again looming. And that's the part of the budget process that needs reforming right now, not a year from now, not 2 years from now. In order to boost economic growth, we should be investing in scientific research and innovation. We should be modernizing our national infrastructure so we can compete in the 21st century economy. And we should be investing in our kids' education so we have a viable and strong workforce. Instead, if you look at the budget put forward by our Republican colleagues, it disinvests in all of those areas. Let me just give a few examples. As a result of the budget numbers put forward in the House, the Department of Education will see its funding cut by $2.8 billion below current levels and provide $1.3 billion less than the President requested for Head Start, potentially cutting services for hundreds of thousands of needy children who stand to benefit, including 7,800 from my own state of Maryland. At a time when so many Americans are struggling to find work and others are seeking to improve their skills to grow their paychecks, the appropriations bill that was the result of the House Republican budget actually cuts funding for employment and training programs below existing levels by almost $1 billion below the President's request. This has real impact in Maryland. It would mean 36,000 fewer people will have access to job training services. It's also doubly painful because many of the provisions in the Republican budget legislation say that in order to qualify for assistance in housing and food, you need to be in a job training program, and then the budget cuts job training programs. Of course, one of the areas that is not cut for the purposes of reducing the deficit in the Republican budget are the over $1 trillion in what the Congressional Budget Office classifies as tax expenditures. So not even the special break for hedge fund managers is touched in order to reduce the deficit. Many of our Republican colleagues have conceded that that current sequester level is unsustainable and irresponsible. The chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, Hal Rogers, said, and I quote, "There is a realization by people we have to do something. We can't pass bills at these sequestration levels." And yet that's what we're dealing with right now. And instead of dealing with that reality, our Republican colleagues decided to try a backdoor attempt to totally circumvent the budget process. Not something we're talking about months from now or a year from now. We're talking about today. I do just want to read again from the Republican budget report from last year that the Republican Budget Committee put out, and here's what they said with respect to OCO, and I quote, "Abuse of the OCO cap adjustment is a backdoor loophole that undermines the integrity of the budget process." So it is a little ironic, Mr. Chairman, that we're having a hearing today about how we can reform the budget process going forward, when by our colleagues' own admission, their current budget is built on a gross violation of the budget process. So I suggest we start in the here and now. Let's come together. Let's deal with the appropriations issue so we can grow our economy and avoid a government shutdown. And with that, I look forward to the testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Hollen. I know in this day and time it's tough not to be partisan. My plan for this is to be the first in a series of hearings on our budget process and how to improve it. And I do indeed hope and pray that it's a unifying issue, and we'll see how much progress we can make on that score as we move forward. I want to let folks know, members know, that any member who wishes to submit a statement for the record, they may do so within 7 calendar days. I want to once again welcome our witnesses, Dr. Primo, Dr. Joyce, Ms. Martin, and Mr. Posner. Thank you for your time today. The committee has received your written testimony and statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your opening remarks, and Dr. Primo, you may begin.
Thank you. Chairman Price, Ranking Member Van Hollen, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here to discuss the need for a fundamental overhaul of the federal budget process. I applaud you for focusing your attention on this pivotal issue. My 3-part message today is this. First, Congress should treat the budget process as a means, not an end, and enact reforms accordingly. Second, given the fiscal challenges facing the country, now is not the time for minor tweaking. Instead, now is the time to think big and craft a process that drives legislators to produce credible and sustainable fiscal policy by constraining federal spending both today and tomorrow. Third, any reform should include effective enforcement mechanisms, preferably constitutional in nature, to prevent the new process from suffering the same fate as the current one. I begin with a basic question. Why should we care about failures in the budget process? The answer is simple. The budget process is a tool, and if it does not work properly, it will hinder Congress's ability to make progress on key fiscal issues. Yet, as Congress undertakes reform and identifies areas in need of change, it will be tempting to focus only on the mechanics of the process, for instance, whether Congress completes all appropriations bills on time. This narrow approach to reform would be a mistake. Now, don't misunderstand, the mechanics of the process are important, and the system is creaky at best. Congressional budget rules are routinely gamed, ignored, or changed, which isn't surprising given the lack of strong enforcement mechanisms. The process is also incomplete, as entitlement spending and other programs fall largely outside current procedures. That said, we should be concerned about process not for process's sake, but rather because of our perilous fiscal situation. In the 40 years since the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act was put into place, the federal government has run a budget deficit about 90% of the time, and the national debt as a share of GDP has roughly tripled. Remarkably, the worst is yet to come, as the CBO's recent long-term budget outlook makes clear. Having established that the process is in need of an overhaul, I now want to discuss where we go from here. What should the broad contours of reform look like? Well, to be an effective tool for improving fiscal policy, and make no mistake, that should be a goal of the process, we must ideally place binding short-run and long-run constraints on spending, and in doing so, force lawmakers to make hard choices. In the short run, limits should be placed on deficits over a multi-year period while allowing deficits in any given fiscal year to account for economic fluctuations. And an approach like this is used in several countries such as Switzerland and Germany. To address long-run fiscal concerns, budgets must account for long-term liabilities from programs such as Medicare and Social Security. Congressional re-election motivations make it too tempting for lawmakers to leave difficult decisions about programs like these for tomorrow. But waiting until there is the political will to act typically means waiting until a crisis occurs. To prevent such delays, budgets should meet targets regarding long-term liabilities for various increments over the course of several decades, rather than look 5 or 10 years into the future as we do today. To implement rules focused on the long run necessitates the calculation of estimates that are, by their very nature, uncertain. That much is true. Still, it's better to produce these educated estimates and plan accordingly than to ignore the problem. Nobody should reason, I'm not sure how long I will live, so there is no point in planning for retirement. Yet that is exactly how the federal government prepares its budgets. Having laid out the direction in which reform should head, I now want to discuss the biggest challenge Congress will face moving forward: making the changes stick. Will policymakers actually use the new process, or will they cast it aside in the interest of political expediency, as they do today? History suggests that political expediency will win, so the most effective way to ensure durability is with a constitutional amendment placing external, enforceable limits on Congress's ability to tax and spend. A constitutional amendment would counteract the temptation to circumvent rules, and it would also provide a foundation on which the new budget process could be built. There is, of course, much more to consider if Congress is serious about reform. Should the congressional committee structure be changed? How can direct spending programs like Medicare be brought into the process? Can voters be educated so that electoral incentives encourage rather than discourage fiscal responsibility? How can rules be designed to avoid evasion? I'm happy to discuss these and any other issues during Q&A, but right now I want to close by restating my main point. The congressional budget process is in dire need of replacement. Now, Alice Rivlin, the former director of both CBO and OMB, has written, quote, "Process can either hamper decision-making or facilitate it, but only at the margins," end quote. I have a great deal of respect for Dr. Rivlin, and many in the policy community on both sides of the aisle share her views about the limits of process reform. My view: marginal improvements just won't do if Congress is serious about tackling the country's fiscal challenges. As they say, go big or go home. Thank you again for inviting me to testify. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Primo. Dr. Joyce.
Thank you, Chairman Price, Ranking Member Van Holling, members of the Budget Committee, for inviting me to share my views on the federal budget process. And I want to start by complimenting you for taking on the task of understanding how reforming the budget process might help us solve the economic and policy problems facing the country. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that even a casual observer of the current budget process would conclude that it doesn't work very well. We're on an unsustainable fiscal path. We've been unable to meet the most basic budget deadlines. In my written testimony, I focus both on lessons from the last 40 years and also some principles to keep in mind going forward, so I'll try to summarize. On lessons learned, my written testimony outlines a bit of budget history since the 1974 Budget Act, which I will spare you in the interest of time, but I want to note three things. First, the budget committees and the budget resolution, as well as CBO, were born out of a desire to have the Congress reassert its role in budgeting. Second, our attempts to use the budget process to try to come to grips with deficits and debt have sometimes worked, but sometimes they haven't. Third, in addition to focusing on the overall budget and budget deficits, there have been a number of successful reforms that have been designed to give the Congress better information on the costs and effects of individual policies, and I think this is quite important. I'll expand on this later. What are the lessons of this history? In terms of fiscal responsibility, the main takeaway is this. The process has worked best when we have had a consensus on a fiscal goal and then have agreed on a multi-year plan in order to meet that goal. The process has not been very good at forcing those changes to happen. This is the lesson both from the Graham-Rudman experiment of the 1980s and also, I would say, of the supercommittee process in 2011. The process has proved to be quite effective at enforcing compliance with agreements that have been reached as long as the political consensus around debt reduction holds. And I think this is the lesson from the 1990s when we eventually did achieve a balanced budget. A second type of lesson I would point to has to do with the costs of unpredictability in the budget process. We have a rather miserable record of meeting budget deadlines. We've only had a budget resolution in 8 of the past 18 fiscal years by my calculation, and the appropriations process has been completed prior to the start of the fiscal year in only 3 of the past 39 years. Instead, in most years, we have government by continuing resolution. This budget uncertainty carries with it a lot of inefficiencies, increased budgetary costs, and compromised effectiveness for federal programs. The cost of budget uncertainty also extends to other types of decisions, and I would point to the current impasse over the highway bill, but also the question of whether the U.S. will raise its debt limit in a timely and predictable manner. A third lesson is that there's substantial evidence that one thing the budget process is very good at, or can be very good at, is providing information, and that this information can have real influence on budget decisions. The CBO cost estimating process, I think, is Exhibit A, but there have also been laws like the Federal Credit Reform Act and the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act that have changed the incentives to enact particular kinds of policies. Thinking about budget process reform, I think, implies thinking seriously about what you think the budget process should be trying to accomplish. And to that end, I'd like to close by listing 5 goals of an effective budget process. And I don't pretend that these are the only goals, but I think they are important ones. The first is that the budget process should promote fiscal discipline. As I suggested earlier, this means a budget process that includes proper budget enforcement procedures and also encourages attention not only to the next year, but also to 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and 30 years from now. Second, the budget process should permit flexibility. Too much rigidity in the budget process can get in the way of responding to particular challenges, such as economic downturns, national security emergencies, or natural disasters. Third, the budget process should meet its deadlines in order to avoid the kinds of costs imposed by the current rather haphazard budget process. Fourth, the budget process should provide appropriate information. And here I would note that the budget process is pretty good on the cost side, although there are continuing debates about how to measure certain costs, and I would encourage you to think about those because those cost measurement issues do have impacts in terms of incentives. The budget process has never been very good at considering the effects of policies simultaneously with their costs. And finally, the budget process should maintain the balance of budgetary power. Strong budget committees and a strong, credible CBO, for example, are essential to the ability of the Congress to continue to present a strong alternative to the fiscal policy path promoted in the President's budget. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share these views, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Joyce. Ms. Martin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Price, Ranking Member Van Hollen, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify. Setting a federal budget that serves the American people is a fundamental task of governing. Unfortunately, the budget process has not been working as it should. Budget decisions have too often been made in the heat of a crisis, which has caused unnecessary economic damage and rushed ill-conceived policies into law. The recent cycle of governing by crisis began in 2011 when disputes over government spending almost led to a government shutdown, nearly caused the federal government to default on the national debt, and ultimately led to sudden across-the-board cuts from sequestration. In 2013, sequestration led to deep cuts in critical programs, including eliminating Head Start slots for 57,000 preschoolers and slashing scientific research. Moreover, years of fiscal policy uncertainty, increased borrowing costs for businesses, reduced annual economic growth, and increased the unemployment rate, as many as 900,000 jobs lost. A 2-year budget agreement finally provided our economy and our government with some stability at the end of 2013. But in 2 months, that compromise expires and spending limits revert to the damaging, arbitrary caps imposed by sequestration. Those spending caps are inadequate to defend the country or grow the economy so that all Americans have a fair shot at a middle-class life. As we face yet another potential crisis, we should keep in mind that compromise is the key to making any budget process work. In fact, sequestration itself is the result of a failed attempt to use budget process rules to solve a political problem caused by a lack of willingness to compromise. The damage of this failure to compromise is still unfolding today. Congress is struggling to write appropriations bills that stay within the sequestration cap for non-defense programs. On the domestic side, they shortchange infrastructure investments, critical education programs, and affordable housing, to name just a few. As Ranking Member Van Hollen points out, as Congress insists on devastating cuts to domestic programs to stay within the sequester cap, appropriators are using a budget gimmick rejected just last year to circumvent the cap on defense spending. It is good that Congress recognizes sequester-level funding is inadequate for defense spending, but this recognition should also extend to domestic programs that directly affect ordinary Americans. The sequester cuts will slow economic growth at a time when the majority of gains from the recovery are going to the top 1% of earners, and many American families still aren't feeling the benefits of renewed growth. Until the benefits of the recovery are shared by average families, still aren't feeling the benefits of renewed growth. Until the benefits of the recovery are shared by average families, we must prioritize investments in infrastructure and human capital to spur widespread growth. Reducing the deficit should become the top priority when the economy is operating at its full potential. We do have long-term fiscal challenges, but those long-term fiscal challenges will not be solved by cutting discretionary spending alone. A deficit reduction agenda that focuses only on discretionary spending, which has been the pattern in recent years, will fall short. For negotiations to succeed in producing a sustainable federal budget, both sides of the budget have to be on the table, revenue and spending. Unfortunately, many members of Congress have rejected the central tenet of bipartisan fiscal compromise by signing a pledge to oppose any tax increase. This refusal to compromise on revenue, not the budget process itself, is what stands in the way of bipartisan budget agreements. Any process reforms should seek to improve the quality of the budget debate and the data that informs it, not attempt to substitute for the policymaking process. Budget process changes should not impose rigid fiscal rules such as spending caps, automatic fiscal triggers, or balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, which would rob lawmakers of the flexibility to act quickly in response to national security threats, natural disasters, or serious recessions. Modifying the overall budget process is an important issue to consider, but the most immediate budget process issue before Congress is lifting the spending caps imposed by sequestration. More process changes are not going to solve this problem. Instead, we need Congress and the White House to compromise to undo the sequester's damaging effects on our economy, which are making it harder for working families to make ends meet. Thank you for inviting me to be here today, and I look forward to further discussion on this topic.
Thank you so much. Mr. Posner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Price, Ranking Member Von Hollen, and the committee. I want to thank you for doing this. Sometimes it's important to rise out of the urgent and deal with the truly important, and you've certainly risen to that challenge. I want to talk a little bit about a roundtable that has been established the past year that I co-chair along with Stuart Butler, now Brookings, and Maya McGinnis, president of the committee responsible for federal budget. And it consists of a bunch of older, senior, grizzled budget veterans from academics and practitioners. David and Phil are both members, Alice Rivlin, Bob Reischauer, Rudy Penner, and a variety of others. And we meet to talk about these challenges, knowing that this is a frustrating area, but like Sisyphus, we're doomed to keep pushing that rock up the hill until it doesn't fall down on us again. And I think we know how frustrating it is. We know how difficult this is, but it's too important not to do. So again, I commend you for doing what you do. I want to talk about 3 areas in particular that I think warrant a focus as you think about blowing up the process and re-examining it, which I think is a good way to think about this. There are 3 areas, in my view, where the budget process is leading us astray. One is an excessive focus on the short term and insufficient prompts to have us exercise foresight to look at longer term challenges. Second, a resource allocation process, not just for the budget process, but the appropriations and across the government, that is excessively balkanized and prevents us from considering major missions and all the programs that comprise them. And third, a need to focus more on relative performance of our investments and programs. What are we getting bang for buck? And how can we, in the budget process, step up the plate to focus more on that? On the long-term budget challenges, CBO, GAO, OMB, every economist in town understands that long-term we are facing, thanks to the aging of the population, continuing rising healthcare costs, and a slower growing labor force, a fiscal challenge in the future, and an economic challenge, a slower growing economy, longer-term deficits in the out years. The question is, do we observe Stein's law, which Dr. Stein, famous economist, once said, if something can't continue, it won't, or do we take charge of that fiscal future and not let it crash in a crisis, but to glide it in a smoother landing for the future of this country? And I think that's the real challenge we face in the budget process, and one we've been dealing with for quite some time. I think there are ways to do that. We have done it selectively in our country. When you look at other countries, they've steered the economy forward to try to avoid some of these, in some ways, predictable long-term crises. It's not easy, but there are 4 areas that I pointed that we need to focus on. One is we're one of the few countries that has no fiscal goal or target for the budget. I think something like a debt to GDP target in the out years that could guide us in the near term is something we should subscribe to. It would enable us to kind of think more clearly about the choices we have to make. The second is reclaiming drift in the budget, particularly with open-ended entitlements and tax expenditures. CBO just gave us numbers that said tax expenditures are now larger than the total amount of discretionary spending in the budget. These are programs in every bit of the way as entitlements are, and we need to take that seriously. Third, ways to use selectively accrual budgeting principles to book costs that are long-term today when we make the irrevocable commitment to engage in claims. For example, pension insurance. We book those programs for PBGC as a net surplus in the budget when that program has an underlying deficit of $34 billion. We've got to think more about accounting, as unglamorous as that sounds, because that in some ways is our future. The fourth is an investment component. I think another area of drift is we drift in and out of decisions on investment without explicitly focusing on targets for the nation, and we need to take that more seriously. The second major area that I want to urge you to think about is thinking more about how Congress and the President together can rise out of the micro focus on budget accounts and individual programs to look at portfolios of programs addressing common missions. In the testimony, I talk about higher education. We have over $100 billion of subsidies from grants, loans, and tax expenditures that never get considered together in the same bucket. They're all considered by different committees, different departments in downtown, and as a result, we have a welter of programs that are confusing and fragmented and probably not well-serving students and families. We need to think about adopting more of a comprehensive budget process periodically to look at these areas. We've seen this in Europe and in Australia. They call it a spending review. I think we need to take action to do that and think about how we can frame the process to do that. And the third is, I want to quote a former budget director who said, I think, a credo that all budgeteers should follow. In the budget process, we should be going after weak claims and not weak claimants. And the point is, we need to be ferreting out areas that are ineffective and inefficient, and we need to be driving performance so that we spend our scarce resources on programs that give a higher bang for the buck. We haven't taken that seriously, I think, in the Congress as much as we should. We've actually done a lot downtown in OMB and the executive branch with GPRA and program assessment rating tool. Congress needs to step up to the plate. I think this committee can take the lead in working with the other committees to periodically do some performance reviews, even as part of the reconciliation process that can generate savings as well as improve government. I think it's going to require, to do all this, a restructuring of this committee. This committee was created in somewhat modest ways to coexist alongside the other committees, even though it had a very bodacious agenda. As we think about the future agenda of this committee, I think we need to think about strengthening its role, possibly reframing it as a leadership committee that would kind of be a college of cardinals, if you will, of all the players, the key players in the Congress that really determine the fiscal future of this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce. Thank you all for your testimony. You have, I think, succeeded in whetting people's appetite about budget process reform, and I appreciate that. And we look forward to your responses to the inquiries from members of the committee here. I want to pull up a couple slides just to kind of set the groundwork. The first slide, if you can, please. This isn't Republican, Democrat. This is just factual here. This is how mandatory spending has grown from 1965 to the present, and then where it's directed, or where it's going on its current path. And the reason this is important from a congressional standpoint is that the blue area, that is the other spending besides mandatory spending, is what we're able to control in our current process on an annual basis if we did the work that needed to be done. So in 1965, Congress had an opportunity truly to affect 2/3 of the federal budget. We're now down to 1/3, and we're going to a quarter in relatively short order, which I think is important for people to appreciate. That's one of the main reasons why the budget process reform is so vital, because the people's representatives are having less and less effect on what the government is doing on an annual basis. Next slide, please. This is again, this isn't Republican or Democrat. These are just numbers. This is the direction that our spending is going on the current path, and under current law, in 2025, we will be spending $808 billion on interest on our debt, which is more than defense, more than health, more than education, more than transportation, more than research and development, all of those things that we talk about needing so badly. So I think that hopefully puts in context the necessity for at least looking at critically and creatively our budget process. Dr. Primo, I was intrigued by many of your statements because I think they painted a stark reality. You stated in the 40 years since the Congressional Budget Impoundment Act was put in place, the national debt as a share of GDP has roughly tripled. So if we're looking at some metrics to say how we doing, I think that says that we need to be doing better. You go on to say, to be effective, the process must place binding short-run and long-run constraints on spending. In doing so, force lawmakers to make hard choices. Budget should adhere to targets regarding long-term liabilities at various points over the course of several decades, rather than simply looking at 5 to 10 years in the future, as is our current practice. And then your solution is a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. So and I support that solution. However, the realities are that I think that's unlikely in certainly the near term. What other kinds of goals should we be looking at that are potentially more politically viable or reasonable in the current situation?
The desire for constitutional reform is born out of experience that, you know, when the going gets tough, members have a tendency not to adhere to process rules. That said, given the political realities you just stated, it would be still beneficial to at least restructure the process with these constraints, these short-run and long-run constraints. And, you know, then if ultimately these rules are violated, well, you know, without the Constitution behind them, that might just be the reality, but at least you can try. So in other words, let's take seriously this idea that you can't worry just about the budget today or the budget next year, or the budget even 10 years from now. You have to be thinking 20, 30 years out. And it's always easy, and I see this time and again, it's always easy. If we're in a recession, politicians will say, we can't do anything about entitlements, we're in hard times. When times are good, politicians will say, well, tax revenues are up because we have economic growth, so we don't need to do anything about the future. But that's really a fallacious argument, because economic conditions today have nothing to do with the realities of the unsustainability of entitlement programs. And so long-run constraints are crucial to any process reform.
Great. Thank you. Go back to the first slide, if you would, please. Dr. Joyce, I was intrigued by your statement that maintaining the balance of budgetary power is important as one of the goals, and I would respectfully suggest that the balance of budgetary power has gotten lopsided in the direction of the executive branch. In essence, the red's the executive branch, the blue's the legislative branch. How can one say, or why is it that you say that we've done a pretty good job in maintaining that balance of budgetary power, when in fact, from a congressional perspective, a legislative perspective, we're getting pinched every single day?
Well, what I'm mainly talking about there is the fact that if you look back at the time prior to the 1974 Budget Act, all of the focus was on the president's budget. That is, when you got to the Congress, the only questions that got asked is how individual congressional decisions differed from the president's budget. There was no capacity for the Congress to lay out a fiscal plan of its own. So the kind of plan that this committee came up with this year, or in fact in the last several years when Chairman Ryan was chairman, that at least set two alternatives. In effect, an alternative that came out of the Congress that was unified and comprehensive, and one for the president. The Congress, prior to that point, had no capacity to develop anything like that. The other piece of this is that I think the Congress has, and you focused on this a bit in your opening statement, I think the Congress has much more capacity to develop its own budgetary information now than it did prior to 1974. I think the existence of these committees, the House and Senate Budget Committee, but also very importantly, CBO, have given the Congress a capacity to actually come up with budget numbers and to challenge the executive branch's numbers that did not exist prior to 1974.
But you would agree, I suspect, that the Congress is losing its ability to affect year-to-year programs from the decrease in the discretionary squeezing.
Yes, although certainly reforming entitlement programs is something that would take effort on the part of the Congress and the President.
Yes.
That is, those are laws. They need to be changed in the same way they were enacted.
And we look forward to doing that. Mr. Posner, I know you were kind of pinched on time, but I'm absolutely fascinated by your perspective on the need for portfolio budgeting, and I wondered if you might take a few minutes and describe further and in more detail what you mean by that, and how we would attempt to affect that change in budget process reform.
Yeah, sure. The basic budget process, the way we budget for programs, is we divide them into very narrow categories, and we budget basically an increment, plus or minus. We don't look at the base, we look at additions or subtractions. And that's appropriate for, busy political leaders and staff and the like. Occasionally, it's important to take a baseline look at what you're doing across a whole area. We don't pull all that together anywhere in the Congress. In some ways, the executive branch is suited to do that. I don't think they do this nearly enough. So you look at other countries like Netherlands and the United Kingdom and places like that, and they periodically do this, Canada, and they've realized great performance enhancements because they pull everything together, say, in higher education. Another area, for example, we've had trouble with is food safety. We have 19 separate federal agencies across major departments focusing on different parts of the food chain. If you have a pizza that's cheese pizza, you get inspected by one agency. If you have pepperoni, you get inspected by another agency. So we have kind of tremendous fragmentation because we never look at these things together. We never assess them against a common set of outcomes and performance benchmarks. So if we take higher education as an example, again, we have 11 tax expenditures and 30-some spending programs, and we really never kind of pull them together and say, what value for money are we delivering to the students, to the universities, to parents, and how can we, if we look at these together, how can we take a more integrated view? And I think that is the way we should be looking at most of the budget periodically. I don't think you can do everything at once.
Sounds wonderful, but what does that look like structurally? Is that a routine structural review? What does it look like from our standpoint structurally?
And I've been kind of thinking about this and talking to various people, because this is something that is a bit challenging for the Congress. One of the things that my colleague here, Steve Rubin, and I have done a paper on this, and we've been challenging OMB to do this, which arguably has all of the kind of wherewithal to do this. Here, this committee, I think, has to take the lead, because you have the broader perspective, you have the budgetary viewpoint. In some respects, I think it could be the kind of thing where where you're working with leadership, you engage the relevant committees together in a task force to look at an area and develop a set of proposals, possibly for the next budget year, possibly in a reconciliation setting. I've thought about, for example, the idea that maybe you have a performance-based reconciliation, where you have certain savings targets that are derived from this kind of portfolio performance-based review, and that becomes the grounds for Congress to consider this in a more comprehensive way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's response, and I really do think that we've begun the foundation for what hopefully will be the critical mass to call for change in the budget process. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having been through a number of these budget battles over the last many years, I've increasingly come to the conclusion that, as I said in my opening remarks, you can try and build a better mousetrap, but at the end of the day, resolving these problems requires political will and compromise. For Mr. Posner, I agree with lots of the proposals you made. I'm not sure any of them achieve the goals that, for example, Dr. Primo is trying to achieve, which is some certainty with respect to reducing the deficit by building in these, quote, enforcement mechanisms. And so, Dr. Primo, the issue with enforcement mechanisms is that in order to build the enforcement mechanism that's going to kick in down the road if you don't achieve your deficit reduction targets, you have to agree now on how you're going to resolve those difficult underlying political issues. If you don't hit your budget deficit target, are you going to have across-the-board cuts in spending? Or are you going to have some cuts in spending plus cuts in tax expenditures so that you achieve your deficit reduction target through a combination of, quote, cuts, but also tax expenditures? Because if you're going to build an enforcement mechanism, you've got to resolve those issues now. Now, we have a real-world example of an enforcement mechanism right in front of us right now. It was the sequester. Do you agree that the cap on defense spending was intended to constrain the spending?
Yeah, I would disagree with the premise of the question that we need to make decisions about the law, about what spending is going to look like in 10 years today in order to have a rule work. If you set, let's say, a target that we're going to have a balanced budget in the next 15 years, okay, you can start today to plan, and then if in 12, 13 years you don't have a balanced budget, then at that point, Congress will have to make some hard decisions. And that's where the constitutional component is so important, that's going to force those decisions. Because I agree with you that Congress is not known for living up to the rules it sets for itself when it comes to budget
Dr.
targets.
Primo, when that day happens, let's just assume Congress doesn't get its act together and it doesn't hit its targets, would you support increasing revenues to help reduce the deficit?
I think that both sides need to come together at that point and decide on what the priorities of the country will be. But and I understand you're pushing in the direction of we need to have revenue reform as well as spending reform. And I don't disagree that the tax code is in dire need of replacement as well. That's another hearing. But in terms of...
But that wasn't my question. I mean, I think everybody's in favor of tax reform. The issue is whether you're in favor of reducing the deficit in part by closing tax breaks. where you use the revenue generated from closing tax breaks to help reduce the deficit that you're talking about. Are you in favor of that?
I think inevitably any agreement on budget reform will include some changes to the tax code.
Okay.
But I think the priority.
Dr. Primo, that was not my question. Yes, there are going to be changes to the tax code. The issue is whether revenue should be a contribution to reducing the deficit. And this is exactly the point Ms. Martin made. She is exactly right. The reason we have not been able to come up with a consensus on how to reduce the long-term deficit is because we haven't achieved a consensus on the mix of doing that through a combination of cuts and revenue. Revenue, we would argue, generated through closing tax breaks. Because the reality is a lot of our colleagues have signed a pledge, as Ms. Martin indicated, where that's a violation. It's a violation of the Grover-Norquist pledge to reduce a tax, to cut one of those tax expenditures to generate revenue to reduce the deficit. That's a violation. Thing. And so this has been a big problem. Now, the reason the sequester is designed the way it was is because when we were at the table, Republicans didn't want to agree that when we reached, when the deficit went over a certain amount, instead of a mix of cuts and revenue generated from closing tax loopholes, we were going to have defense and non-defense, right? That was going to be the key trigger, because there's agreement among Democrats and Republicans we needed strong national security. But Democrats also believe that we need to invest in education and transportation and scientific research to help grow the economy. But our Republican colleagues did not want to include a trigger, an enforcement mechanism that included any revenue to reduce the deficit. And so the enforcement mechanism now is a defense cap and a non-defense cap. That's why it's there. And yet, 1 year ago, when this committee was looking over this, they agreed that playing around with OCO was a, quote, undermines the integrity of the budget process. And yet here we are today with a budget that plays around with OCO. I mean, no one's pretending that's not the case. So this is an enforcement mechanism that's here and now. This isn't like some constitutional amendment years from now where it may be structured to have cuts. It may say, actually, in order to raise revenue, you need 2/3, which is what I've seen from a lot of these proposals, right? This is a democracy, but we're going to build into the Constitution. You need 2/3 to do revenue. But anyway, all those enforcement mechanisms actually do presuppose a certain way we're going to tackle this problem that requires us to get at the underlying issue. And the fact is we haven't been able to. And this is a real-world example. Do you agree with what the Republican Budget Committee report said last year, that using the OCO the way it's being used this year undermines the integrity of the budget process?
I think the history of the federal budget process on both sides of the aisle is one where the rules are used to one's advantage, and that's done on both sides of the aisle. So I mean, we can have a discussion about Democrats using the budget process to their advantage as well.
I think if you look at different things that would be put in the budget like this, you have SGR, right? We know about SGR. SGR actually had some mixed. It was overall, I think, probably never worked well, but at times it forced some decision making. There's another provision that's a budget enforcement mechanism in the code. It's called IPAB. Our Republican colleagues don't like it, but it's a forcing mechanism in the future, and it actually lays out how reductions would be made. It specifically says, by the way, that we're not going to cut beneficiaries, but it's a process that has an enforcement mechanism. Republican colleagues don't like it. Okay, they don't have to like it, but the reason I'm glad the chairman's having this hearing, because it just, from my perspective, underscores the fact that if you're really going to make this stuff enforceable, then you got to resolve the underlying issues. You can say a constitutional amendment, you're going to achieve a certain reduction, but you just said when the time comes and Congress hasn't resolved it, they're all going to have to get together at that time. Well, that's what we should be doing, getting together. So I would just urge my colleagues, as they look at this budget stuff, that I think some of the ideas Mr. Posner had are in terms of more information, and I like the performance-based approach. But at the end of the day, the political reality is people are going to have to make some tough decisions. And in order to make them have an enforceable thing, you've got to resolve those tough issues here and now. And we've just not unfortunately been able to do it. So sorry to be a little skeptical, although I'm all for trying to find a better way, and I think there's some ways to get better information. Ms. Martin, if you could just, talk about how the fact that we are in the sequester right now, is impacting many of our domestic investment programs. You touched on some of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the toughest cuts are the ones that you mentioned, Congressman, in terms of education and job training. And something to keep in mind is that's at the end. Those agencies have been cut over time. This isn't the first time they're being cut. They were cut at the beginning of the sequestration. So if you look at the funding level for the Department of Education, for example, and you compare that to 2010 levels, the Department of Education has been cut by 10%, Department of Labor, 22%. In housing, the home program, which helps low-income people be able to have affordable housing, that's been cut 50% if you compare the level of funding from 2010 till now. I would say if you look at the chairman's chart with the blue and the red, one of the reasons you see the blue becoming so small is because since the recession, the non-defense discretionary spending has been slashed over and over again. So that's one of the reasons you see the level of funding is going down so dramatically. I would also take issue with the fact that the red is not in congressional control. The president has put forth proposals that would bring down spending in terms of mandatory programs. CAP has put forth proposals for smart cuts to Medicare spending that would bring down the costs of those programs. We've put forth a proposal through the Peterson Initiative that would bring down the deficit. We would have deficit spending brought to zero over time, over a 20-year period. Basically, we focus on three things: investments in middle-class families so we could grow the middle class, which would increase economic growth, which would actually bring down the deficit, bringing down health care costs through the Medicare program, and the third way we would do that would be by increasing revenue. So we do think there are ways to tackle the long-term debt and bring down deficits, but in the short term, that means investing in the economy, not disinvesting in the economy.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Okita is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair for holding this hearing. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. I always learn a lot. Well, starting for purposes of the record here, I'm showing the committee and the witnesses, again, what's sometimes referred to as the Pac-Man slide. And what you see there is mandatory spending as a percentage, Ms. Martin, gobbling up our total federal spend. So this isn't a matter of cutting here or there, or if it was, then you'd see some part get smaller without the other part getting bigger. What this is really indicating is how mandatory, mostly executive spending is gobbling up the budget. I'd also point out that, let's just take one example, education. Since the federal government has been involved in education, we've increased spending 300%. And to Mr. Posner's and some of the other folks' point here in terms of performance reviews, if you look at one measure of a performance review, you see that, you can see it in test scores. And in that same period of time, test scores have been flatlined. So we spent 300% more in education at the federal level and got no test score increase as a result. You know, so I'd say that throwing more money at things, to the ranking member as well, isn't necessarily the way to solve it. And we see that time and time again in budget programs.
Can I respond?
No.
Okay.
I'm sure you'll have time. Mr. Posner, can you talk to me more about performance reviews? I use that as an example, my own performance review from the Education Committee, but can you go into more detail about what you're talking about? Because I think you seem to be onto something.
Yeah, well, you know, we've done performance reviews in the executive branch. The Bush administration did the program assessment rating tool, which tried to evaluate every program in the budget, which was too much too soon. But this is kind of what we've seen other countries do, that we've now had 30 years after GPRA where federal agencies have been developing performance goals, performance standards and plans, and metrics. So we actually have a fair amount of sophistication of, you know, what we're achieving in many of our programs and good evaluation studies. This administration has continued that investment and ramped it up with evidence-based management. Now we have to do something with it in the budget process. We really haven't use those in a fulsome way. And so one notion that we've been talking about, a little bit like I think your House budget resolution did, is you would have required the committees to scour their programs and look at GAO, IG reports, and performance data to come up with areas where savings could be had based on performance, where the weak claims could be ferreted out, and report back, and more of a, as I understood it, kind of a reconciliation, where they would report back to the Budget Committee potential savings in, say, education grant programs or higher education loans or whatever it is, and then Congress would have a menu of changes that it could deliberate based where the savings would be not across the board cuts, as we rightly said, is not no one's idea of the right way to go about this, but targeted cuts based on the relative rate of return of different programs and areas that are falling short. And that strikes me as a way to start having this conversation in the Congress.
And wouldn't it be true, though, you need, and I guess it's to the ranking member's point, sort of, you need a cooperative executive. You need an OMB, at least, to help drive some of this, or can this all be done by legislators?
Well, I think you could start the process. I think the executive branch has had, we're not talking the White House, we're talking OMB and the agencies, a consistent and persistent dedication to identifying the performance consequences of programs, and I think you'd find a lot of expertise at your disposal, as well as within GAO.
Thank you. And to Dr. Joyce, you're nodding your head. Something to add, and also add to your answer, if you know of a model state or nation even that you'd have us follow in terms of budget process.
Well, in terms of Mr. Posner's point, I was nodding my head because we really have about 20 or 25 years of experience of developing more performance information. Where we have fallen short is in the use of that information. So I think you would find, if you looked carefully, that the executive branch actually has a fair amount of information that would help you answer questions about what works and what doesn't. The challenge has always been to get that information into the budget process. And there are various states, the ones that come to mind. I was part of a study a few years ago looking at states and their experiences, and states like Washington, Virginia, Utah, they're all states that have done quite a bit in terms of trying to both develop better performance information but also integrate it into their budget process. I'd be happy to talk to you and your staff more about that.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Yarmouth from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel. Ms. Martin, I will give you a little bit of time now if you'd like to respond to Mr. Rokita.
I would certainly agree that the U.S. has more work to do in terms of improving our performance in education, but we have certainly made great strides on test scores over the last generation. High school graduation rates are an all-time high. I would say where we need to make the most improvement is in terms of closing achievement gaps. What most experts would say is we don't spend our money well in terms of spending it on those who need it the most. We spend more money than other countries internationally, but what we don't do is spend it on, we spend a lot of money on children who have a lot of money, and we don't spend a lot of money on the children who have deficits. So we have some of the greatest inequalities in spending internationally. So I think that that's one of the reasons we have some of the greatest achievement gaps internationally. But we have made great strides over time in terms of educational achievement.
Thanks. I need to reclaim my time because I've got some areas I want to cover. I want to give you that shot. Dr. Joyce, you said in your testimony, you wrote in your written testimony, you wrote, all of the successful efforts at deficit reduction in the last 3 decades have one basic thing in common. The President and the Congress agreed on a future path for the budget and on a set of policy actions, and then the process was used to enforce compliance with those actions. In many, if not all of those agreements, I assume concessions were made on both sides. That not be true?
Yes.
Well, hypothetically, what if one side had insisted on massive tax cuts or massive entitlement increases and added that they could not be scored, that they would have no impact on the budget? Would previous agreements that you're talking about have happened under those conditions?
I think it's unlikely, although I will say that one of the agreements, the one in 1993, is actually exceptional in the sense that it is an agreement that was not a bipartisan agreement, but an agreement where it passed both houses without a single Republican vote. It was sort of a Democrat-only plan, with that exception.
So, in general, a budget proposal that fails to include the revenue impact of tax cuts would not be considered a serious effort at a budget, right?
I would put it a different way, which is to say, given the magnitude of the fiscal problem that we face, it's hard to imagine that we can make sufficient progress unless we're looking at both entitlements, entitlements, discretionary spending, and revenues. The question would be, what's the mix?
Right, gotcha. So for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I'd like to point out that their own witness is essentially stating that the Republican budget is not a serious document, or at least not an effective one. Ms. Martin, I want to talk a little bit more about another aspect of budgeting. And one of the things that seems to me we have to have at some point in the discussion about budget process is budget philosophy. Because, about the philosophy of government, what the proper role of the federal government is. Mr. Akita actually questioned the federal role in education. It's a legitimate question. Many people question all aspects of federal government activity. But the Constitution says, obviously, we have an obligation to defend the country, so that goes without saying. And it also says we have the responsibility to promote the general welfare, which is open to an enormous amount of interpretations. But it seems to me that if we embark upon a budget process reform initiative that is aimed at only one thing, which it seems to be in this case, and that is deficit reduction, that we're ignoring the fundamental question of what government does. Don't we have to kind of figure out what we want government to do before we come up with a process that will budget for that, those obligations?
Yes, and I mean, I would argue that in the process of ensuring that you're reducing deficits and making debt manageable, you're also need to ensure that you're ensuring a healthy economy, because one of the most important ways you can keep debt manageable is by growing the economy. So sometimes that requires actually investing in government programs.
Which would be a fundamental question about what the role of government is.
Exactly.
And we had back in 2008 and 2009, we had an enormous shortfall in revenues. Government had obligations, both to keep the economy moving and also to help people get through this serious time. We came up with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which, maybe you could budget for that, but I doubt it. But those kinds of distortions in the economy are going to happen.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I always learn a lot on this committee, and your testimony has certainly been enlightening. A quote comes to mind here: "Failure to plan is a plan to fail." And without any kind of a plan, you're completely reactionary and reacting to daily events and headlines, as we seem to do here in the United States government way too much. We're trying to run here, I believe, what could be the most complex entity on earth, and yet we haven't had this is the first time we've had a budget in 5 years. I think the last time we completed the budget and all of our appropriations bills was over 20 years ago. And I believe a budget is an essential part of any planning process and reflects your priorities. Dr. Primo, would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and in my interactions with Congressman Van Hollen, he gave the impression that we need to have rules. We need to have an agreement on exactly how we're going to fix our budget problems before we can have rules. But I think that a new budget process that has these external enforceable rules will force us to start thinking about these long-run problems today rather than waiting, decades into the future. We need a budget process that works, and that works better if we're going to handle entitlements. So the idea that we're going to do it all at the same time just isn't going to hold.
Do you think if we had an enforceable budget process, we would be less reactionary and have a plan?
I do, because nothing focuses the mind like having to make a
I have
decision.
a very short period of time, so I have to kind of buzz through this. Does the entity that you work for have a budget?
Yes.
And do they review it annually?
Yes.
Dr. Joyce, the same question to you. Do you think that if we had a enforceable budget process, we would be less reactionary and more effective?
I think if you had a consensus on what the goal was, you would be less reactionary.
And does the entity that you work for have a budget that's reviewed annually?
Yes.
Mrs. Martin, do you believe if we had an enforceable process for determining our budget, which would reflect our priorities, that we would be more effective?
If you had agreed to priorities,
And does the entity that you work for have a budget?
yes,
And is it reviewed annually?
yes.
Dr. Posner, same question for you. Do you think if we had an enforceable budget process that we would be more effective?
Well, I think potentially it depends on which areas we're covering there. If
Okay,
we-
well, let me
yeah.
step back then so I can get you more specific. We haven't had a budget in 5 years.
Right.
We haven't gone through the appropriations process in over 20 years. We are, appears to me, to be flailing around and reacting to headlines. Do you think if we had an enforceable budget process, we would be more effective?
Sure, sure.
Does the entity that you work for have a budget?
Yes, we do.
Is it reviewed annually?
Yes, it is.
Dr. Posner, could you give me, Mr. Posner, could you give me a grade, A through F, of the federal government's budget process?
Oh, boy. Let me compare it with other nations that I've studied quite a
Okay,
bit.
I don't have enough.
I'd say about a D.
A D. Mrs. Martin, how would you evaluate how well the federal budget process is working? We haven't had a budget in 5 years. We haven't completed the budget process in over 20. Give me a grade.
Well, the process
You got
itself,
10 seconds.
the process, a C.
A
the-
C? Okay.
the-
Dr.
the-
Joyce, how would you grade our budget process?
I think a C sounds right.
A C? Wow, I'm amazed. Dr. Primo,
If the budget process were a student in my class, I would give it an incomplete.
an incomplete. All right. I think our budget process is incredibly inadequate. I think that we are failing to plan, and we are doing a horrible job in terms of setting out a path for our country. Let me ask you this, Dr. Primo. How would you start the process of redesigning the budget process? I mean, these people sitting here in Congress are all very brilliant people, but I don't know how many systems experts we have here. Who would you go to start that process?
So if your question is asking sort of about the mechanics of the process,
I'm going to have to limit you to about 10 seconds.
yeah,
Who
I
would you go to?
I would start with CBO, OMB, GAO, all of the organizations.
What about outside people that are experts in systems design? Would that make any sense?
It's worth a try.
Yes, sir. Dr. Joyce?
I would go to the experts. I would go to the kind of people that Dr. Posner was talking about, but I would also, you need to have people that understand the political process, and I'm not sure systems designers necessarily understand the forces that you face.
Okay, Mrs. Martin? How would you recommend starting a process to fix our broken budget process? I have 34 seconds left, and I got to get to Dr. Posner.
I don't think the process is the problem. I think it's the people who are the problem. So I would make you all
Okay,
get in a
thank you
room.
for that, Mr. Posner.
I wouldn't start with the private sector. Someone once said the public and private sectors are alike in all unimportant respects. I think we have a much more difficult problem. We don't have agreement. So I would primarily focus on the political. Where can you reach agreement, and how can you weave a process around that?
Okay, Mrs. Martin, we haven't had a full, complete process in 25 years. If you don't think it's broken, you're blind.
Gentleman's
Thank
time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Ryan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've laughed a lot during this hearing for some reason. And I think it's because we are all frustrated with the process, which we think is the process. But as has been mentioned here today, back in both 1990 and the 93 budget, we were able to make it work. because of the political process, was much different. After those two budgets, both, read my lips, no new taxes, and the pay-as-you-go reforms that were put on in the 90 budget, and then the 93 budget, we had the largest peacetime expansion in the history of the country, 20 million new jobs. Every category of income saw an increase. And that was a tough political fight that was mentioned, was passed by the Democrats solely. So it was a Democratic budget. And then with the money that was coming in, Republicans came in 94, in large measure in reaction to the decisions that were made to balance that budget. Then Speaker Gingrich and President Clinton sat down and made investments into immunizations, children's health care, and all the rest. Then, I find this historical account instructive, then, with this big surplus, a change in philosophy of government came in, and that money was all given back, and many of my constituents got $300, maybe $600 in a tax cut. Now, a most recent report came out on our public infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, so on and so forth. In Cleveland, Ohio, or Akron, Ohio, the average driver will see a $700 to $800 increase in what they've got to pay in car repairs because the roads stink. So I want to ask Mr. Posner about this investment proposal or investment component that you were talking about. Because one of the frustrations we had in this committee during the whole health care debate, going back to the Congressional Budget Office, we couldn't get them to score preventative health care. We couldn't see any benefit in the accounting long-term because they would not account for prevention when we all know that investments in health, in immunization, screenings, all the rest, save money in the long run. So, Mr. Posner, when you're talking about an investment component, can you explain to us exactly what it is you mean and how that would function?
Yeah, okay. And let me talk about the first part, because you're right. We have had periods where we've had budgetary calm and enlightenment on an episodic, heroic basis. I think what we're talking about is how do you make that more institutionalized? How do you provide the incentives to try to have what we saw in the 90s happen more regularly? And I think the enemy of this process is drift. It's the fact that we have control over a limited portion of the budget and the rest of it just goes on by automatic pilot, including investment. OMB does a chapter in the federal budget every year that totes it all up after the fact. Congress doesn't sit down and say, here are the areas with CBO or GAO and both that have the most kind of productive potential for the economy in research development, human capital, and infrastructure. And CBO has done periodic reports on this, by the way, identifying the cost-benefit ratios, where are the promising areas for investment. I think you can take that and work with that, and the notion is to, within the discretionary caps, develop a component on investment that could be carved out. And that would become a debate within the Congress. How much do we want to focus on investment? And I'm not sure that I would, by the way, hang myself too much on the savings there. I think you do it because it's good for the economy and it's good for people. I've seen estimates on, anti-smoking campaigns that suggest it actually makes people live longer and they die of more grisly and expensive diseases. So I don't think the savings argument is your best argument. I think that's good public policy for the nation for the future. And we should be deliberating about that explicitly.
Those investments will grow the economy.
Grow the economy and social opportunities and the like.
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to ask Ms. Martin a question, but you've been asked enough questions where somebody said, hurry up and answer, you got 10 seconds. So I won't do that to you because you only have 10 seconds left. So thank you. This has been very helpful, Mr. Chairman, and I am very interested in the long-term discussion here, especially with the performance review and the investment piece. I think there may be some common ground here that maybe we can possibly work on. The other components I don't necessarily agree with, but
I
appreciate the opportunity.
Thank the gentleman for recognizing that possible common ground. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Stutzman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here today and for your insight and for your comments regarding our budgetary process. I'd like to start, I guess, to kind of follow up after Mr. Rice's questions and comments about what entities we could look at. I think one of the places we could look at are the states. You look at the states across the country and who have a variety of different budgetary processes that do show us success, and that and I would say that I come from one of those states that has had success. Indiana right now has a $2 billion surplus. Budget's obviously much smaller than what the federal budget is, but the principles are still the same. And I think that that's one of the places that we should be looking. And when I asked the panel, two things that I think would make a huge difference. I know it's easy to talk about cutting spending and tax increases or revenue, whatever you want to call it, but I think one of the big equations that we're missing is economic growth. Economic growth is going to help lead us out of the malaise that we're in, but instead we're seeing policies that only have limited growth and limited opportunity for Americans all across the country. I know for us in Indiana, when I served in the Indiana legislature, every year, our governor, Democrat or Republican, would propose a budget. And that budget was always considered the starting point. And unfortunately, I haven't seen that happen here in Washington the way that it should. The executive branch should propose a budget that both parties can take and start to work from, but not when President Obama's budget is even offered on the floor of the House, his own party's not even voting for it. And so I think that shows a lack of leadership and a place to start for the budgetary process in Washington. Two things that I think, and I'd like to hear your comments on. First of all, I think a balanced budget amendment, it's a place that starts us all. And I'm not saying it has to be 2/3, support a tax increase. I just think that your income or your expenses need to be equal to your revenue. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on a balanced budget amendment, and I think it's one thing that would help start the federal government back to fiscal responsibility. And I'll start with Dr. Primo and just move down the line in maybe 15 to 20 seconds, please.
Sure. I think constitutional amendments, as I mentioned in my testimony, are crucial because they provide enforceable mechanism for congressional responsibility. And I think the key is that those rules are designed carefully, and importantly, that they're put into place now so that they, as you mentioned, serve as a structure for negotiations moving forward. Just very quickly, I mentioned in my testimony 90% of the federal government's budgets have been in deficit over the last 40 years.
Yep.
We should flip that, right? Maybe 10% of the time we should be in deficit, not 90% of the time.
That's right. Dr. Joyce.
I agree with Dr. Primo that it's important that we have a consensus on some kind of overall goal. I'm not sure that an annually balanced budget is the right goal. Even if it was, I don't think we have the 7 or 8 years that it would take in order to make it happen. I think we need to start before that, and if we start before that, that's really the important thing to do, is to sort of start the process, because whether it's a constitutional amendment or something else, these things are not self-enforcing. That is, we'd have to pass enforcement legislation, and we'd have to figure out what policies we want to come up with.
Yeah, and I would say this in Indiana, with a surplus, our economy is doing much better than with a deficit. And so I think we're better off with surpluses rather than deficits. Ms. Martin.
I think a balanced budget amendment is a bad idea. I think it would rob policymakers of the ability to respond to national emergencies, natural disasters, and to be able to manage the economy. I think that's a big difference between Congress and state legislatures, is that you do have a role in managing the national economy. That said, we've put forward the plan that would get the country to a deficit neutral position. So I think that is a goal that Congress should strive for. But I think part of our plan is to increase the deficit in the short term, because those investments that you're making in the short term would actually grow the economy, which would, in the long term, reduce the deficit.
Thank you. Mr. Posner.
I wouldn't want to be in the states after we pass a balanced budget amendment. Talk about unfunded mandates. I think there's all sorts of incentive effects that happen as a result of that. And frankly, I'm not sure that I want to welcome the courts to be adjudicating what is spending and what's on and off budget and all the thousands of other cases that are going to come before them. I think it's a really troublesome prospect, and I think we can do better through normal order and the regular process than having to resort to this kind of means.
Thank you. I would agree with that, and that we have $18 trillion of debt without a balanced budget amendment. Thank you.
From New Jersey, Mr. Norcross is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Certainly appreciate it. I was given for Christmas Ken Burns' documentary, his first one he ever made. It was on Congress. And it opens up by a few historians who talked about the basis for Congress was compromise. And I say that as a precursor to my first question. Chicken or the egg, which came first? Are we, as Congress, is the budget broken, the process, or are we using the budget as an excuse, saying for our dysfunction? And I'll go right down the line.
You know, if you all could agree on entitlement reform, you're right, the process, you know, today, right now, in this room, right, the process wouldn't matter as much. But given that there are these fundamental disagreements, you need a robust budget process to force decisions when compromise just isn't possible or isn't feasible in the short run.
So you're suggesting that the arbitrator in this case is the budget?
I'm suggesting that you need to start with the premise we're going to act in a fiscally responsible way and then work it out what that's going to be.
There. But in light of that, and you cannot arrive at that, you're going to use the budget process as that arbitrator.
I would use it as a spur to action, yes.
Thank you.
I think the budget process, the failures of the larger budget process and the sort of macro fiscal issues that we face are actually a symptom of the larger political problems that we have rather than the cause of those problems. Having said that, I don't think that means that budget process reform isn't an important thing to do, but I think the thing to focus on are things like the enforcement mechanisms when agreements are reached, how do you account for costs in the budget, the kinds of things that Professor Posner was talking about in terms of both considering not only the costs and effects of legislation. So I think lots of important things you can do in budget process reform. I think, and I said this in my testimony, I'm skeptical of the ability of the budget process to force us to do things that we don't have a political consensus to do.
Thank you.
I don't think the budget process is the problem in recent years, and I actually think the use of budget process to fix the problem in recent years has made things worse. I think sequestration is a perfect example of that. Congress used a process to try to force them to compromise, and it made matters worse.
One of our colleagues, Rudy Penner, often is fond of saying, the process isn't the problem is the problem. And in some respects, he's right. I mean, things have gotten much worse politically, greater polarization, greater visibility, the social media, the fishbowl that you're operating in. All that makes it much more difficult to do budgets. But I don't think that means that process reform is hopeless. I think it means that process reform is more important because essentially we're swimming against a much more difficult tide. 60 years ago, you know, there was much more consensus here, and there was much more kind of normal order could prevail. And now, because of the political winds, it's more difficult to budget, but also more vital to get it right.
So what I'm hearing from our panel of experts is that the budget process is a tool. Good information in, hopefully we'll get good information out. But in the meantime, the budget process isn't the problem. We control our own destiny and use the budget as a vehicle. So when I look at that, a couple years ago we entered into a sequestration. Excellent point. Ms. Martin, if you could expand on the sequestration, because we just took the power of our hands and forced us to make a decision. Was that the right way to go?
I don't think so. I think as a result, there were deep cuts in very critical programs that I think have hurt the economy instead of helped the economy. And I think the budget that's before the House right now is on track to make some more of those damaging cuts. For example, the House appropriation bill would cut funding for Tiger grants by $1.2 billion below the president's request. That's a critical transportation program that many communities rely on. The FAA is going to be funded at its lowest level in 15 years. Critical housing programs will be cut.
Exactly the point I want to make, and as my time is running out, is that yes isn't the answer to every budget issue, and no isn't the answer. It's about compromise. It's about us working together. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me continue on that general theme. The ranking member said that the current budget caps are unsustainable. The Democratic witness tells us the most important thing is to lift the spending caps, and yet that seems to ignore the trajectory we are on that is absolutely frightening. We paid $230 billion this year just to meet our interest costs. That means if you're an average family paying average taxes, about $2,000 of what you sent to Washington this year did nothing more than rent the money that this government has already spent. The CBO is screaming the warning at us that the chairman indicated earlier. In 8 years, on our current trajectory, our interest costs will actually exceed our entire defense budget. 7 years after that, Medicare runs out of money. 3 years after that, Social Security goes belly up. It seems that this is no longer an issue for our kids and grandkids that they may have to deal with someday if we don't get our act together. This is an iceberg that is straight ahead, and we're running out of time to change our course. To suggest that we should spend even faster and accelerate this crisis leaves me absolutely dumbfounded. It reminds me of Louis XIV's famous line, after us, the deluge. Now, the Democrats say, oh, that's easy, just raise taxes. But Dr. Posner, doesn't history warn us that there's an upper limit to taxes in which every increase in tax rates produces decreases in revenue because tax avoidance activity and tax evasion activity increases and economic growth begins to slow?
Sorry. I think that can happen if rates are very high, and depending on a lot of other things. When we had income tax rates in the 90% percentile in John Kennedy's time, that was a concern. I think now, thanks to tax reform and tax reductions in various ways, we don't have those kinds of threats. I think a lot of that depends on what alternatives do you have to invest your money. Can you go to a lower tax jurisdiction? What alternatives do you have with your time? So certainly there are leakages.
And what distortions is
you can have
our
distortions,
system
absolutely.
producing in the natural flow of dollars to their highest and best use. Dr. Primo, we're told that taxes are an antidote to debt, but really aren't taxes and debt the same thing? Isn't debt simply a future tax? You either produce it now through taxes, or you borrow it now and produce it later as taxes. But either way, aren't these the only two possible ways that we can we pay for spending?
Well, there's a third way, but it's a way that nobody wants, and that's you default on your debt.
Well,
or you inflate it away. So there are certainly unsavory ways to deal with it.
My point is that both debt and taxes are really the same thing. It seems to me that argues towards setting a rate that maximizes both economic growth and revenue, and you don't spend in excess of that revenue except in a national emergency. Doesn't that argue in favor of a balanced budget amendment?
I agree 100% that we need to have the norm in the United States be that budgets be in balance. Now, I do not believe that every single year you need to have a perfectly balanced budget. I do think in some years deficits are warranted.
Yes, well,
but the idea is that the norm should be balanced budgets. Whereas now,
in a national emergency, that's certainly the case. I've introduced legislation that calls on forbids the Congress from increasing debt except for a specific purpose. By a 3/4 majority of both houses. That trusts future Congresses to know a crisis when they see one, but it also trusts that at least a quarter of the Congress will be able to resist a borrowing for frivolous purposes. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense to limit deficits to unusual circumstances. Deficit should be the exception and not the rule.
Is it wise to put 2/3 of our spending outside of the annual review of Congress, as Mr. Rokita mentioned? I mean, even if we control discretionary spending, The true driver right now is mandatory spending. Shouldn't all spending, except for interest on the debt, be discretionary?
I think all spending should be on the table for discussion because, you know, as you pointed out, entitlements is such a big part of the process, but yet you're right, discretionary spending is what sucks up all the oxygen in the room.
For Dr. Posner, you mentioned increased rates associated with the uncertainty over our debt limit. Would a measure that gives the Treasury Secretary the ability to borrow to meet principal and interest, in other words, guaranteeing timely payment of our debt, regardless of congressional gridlock, would that be putting us back in the right direction?
Quick response, please.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Dr. Bratt, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you all very much for being with us. Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to ask you all a question at the end. It's roughly going to be, is the free market system morally good or not? And I look forward to, I'm going to frame that for you a little bit. I think this discussion has been a little bit misguided. We all going back on taxes and revenues and balanced budgets and the process. The process, my colleague behind me said, you have to be aimed at a target. I agree with that. The target, I think, that's most important is the establishment of a free market system. And I'll explain why that is. Ms. Martin made mention of huge education gaps and all this kind of thing. We're currently spending $12,000 across the country on everybody. It's mandated. We have huge special education programs on top of that. English second language programs are very expensive for the very people you're talking about, over and above what the average person receives. And so education is important, but you can have some pretty famous lineups. You can have Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle in order and have zero economic growth. You can have the brightest minds in human history in order, and you can have zero economic growth for all of human history until 1800. Modern economic growth only starts in 1800. And so that's why I'm going to ask you, is the free market system, which has given us all the programs which Ms. Martin talks about. There were no housing programs, there were no education programs, there were no science programs, there were no welfare programs prior to the free market system getting us from $500 a year per capita for all of human history up till about 1800, and now we're at $50,000 a year per person. So you can argue about tax rates and, you know, this kind of thing and revenues, and everyone will differ on the politics, but you cannot dispute the claim I'm making, that without the free market system, you get nothing. And so we have to answer that question, and on the politics, some on the other side, for some reason, don't want to go there, and I find it, as a professor of economics, just mind-numbing how we're not in agreement on that. It's like not accepting the existence of oxygen. So let me just make the statement even a little bit more problematic for the other side. You can have science for all of human history and no economic growth. You can have roads and bridge investments. We're told that this creates tremendous economic growth. That is absolutely false. Until you have the free market system, roads and bridges and the Roman aqueducts did not produce modern economic growth. You can have oil reserves. That will not give you economic growth or any of the programs you want on the other side. You can have trade for all of human history. And without the free market system, you will not get any economic growth. So we've had some language, Ms. Martinez said the key word that caught my ears and got me going, we need to manage the economy. No, we do not. If you manage the economy from Rome, you will get the exact growth rate that Rome got, about zero. And you'll get utter poverty for all of human history for the rest of the world. China and India have brought 2.5 billion people out of poverty in the last 20 years by going toward the free market system as we go away from it and stifle our economy with overregulation. So I don't think we should head toward what Hayek called the fatal conceit of trying to manage our economy from the top down. I think we have to do what's best for all human beings, and as far as I see, it's a commitment to the free market system. So with that, I'll ask you to very briefly try and give me your answer, and if you want to add a couple sentences, is the free market system morally good or morally problematic?
I think the free market system is certainly the best way to allocate scarce resources, and we live in a world of scarcity, and without a free market system, I agree with you on the point that without a free market system, you're not likely to see the kinds of wealth and innovation that we see in a society like the United States.
Good. Dr. Joyce?
I think the free market system is sometimes morally good and sometimes not, but I think that all economists, as far as I know, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, agree that there is something called market failure, and that there are places where that means that government has a role. And the real question for you and your colleagues is, what is that role for government, and sort of how expansive is it?
Good. All these guys are 20 seconds. Ms. Martin, give me 20 good seconds.
I support the free market system, but believe the government has a role in investing in the economy. So during the Great Recession, the government invested through ARA, which made us in much better shape than other countries around the world.
17, go, Dr.
Oh, boy, the bar's getting higher here. Obviously, a free market system has tremendous potential for allocating goods and resources. I think obviously government's going to play a role, if nothing else, to save the free market system from itself. I think the question for you is, which areas have we become overextended? Which areas have we not? And I think some of the tax expenditures that Mr. McClintock was talking about, the deduction for housing interest, the deduction for health care insurance, are areas where we step too far in and distort the allocation of goods and services.
Thank you all very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, I thank the panel, and I'm going to follow up on that interesting line of questioning. So, Ms. Martin, you said in your 5 seconds, we're in much better shape, and you went on with that. You know, I just came from financial services hearing when we were talking about various issues, and Senator Graham was there, and he had a nice chart up on the wall comparing where we are today because of all the great management of this economy by this administration compared to past recessions and great recessions. And you'd see, if we had that chart here, one line showing right near the bottom, basically where we are as far as growth GDP, and another great line right above it showing where past recessions would have come out. In other words, we're doing worse because of the investment, which is basically another euphemism for taking money out of taxpayer dollars, taxpayers' pockets, and putting it into politicians' hands to spend as they see fit. So you say we're in better shape. Well, not better shape than historical averages on this topic.
Well, I got cut off. I said better shape than other countries around the world that didn't invest in their economy.
Other countries around the world that try to manage their economies as well. So I guess when you have management of the economies by these central bankers, we see it failed miserably in other parts of the world, and it just failed miserably here in the United States as well. And I guess when it comes to the issue of whether we should be looking for the central banks or this administration to managing the overall economy for a $17 trillion economy, the first thing to see is how well are we managing our $3 or $4 trillion budget ourselves. And I think the advice from this panel is we're not doing a very good job with our own budget. Now, to that point, Doctor, you do make references to a constitutional amendment as being one solution to it, potentially, but even that has problems because it takes so long to ratify, and you say that we need certain enforcement mechanisms. Can you lay out in 30 seconds some of those other enforcement mechanisms that we could do now?
Well, what you could do is set those long-run and short-run budget constraints that I had laid out in my testimony, and then you need to design, you need to have those be enforced within the institution through points of order or other means.
So to that point, I think to Mr. McClintock, you said, well, you could not necessarily have a balanced budget every single year, maybe not this year, but next year. But isn't it the nature of the budgetary process right now that you would say, okay, this year, the current year is always the year that you're not going to have a balanced budget. We're going to have a balanced budget next year. Isn't that the way that Congress normally act if you didn't have a requirement that every year you have a balanced budget?
That's a fair point, but what you do is you require that the budgets be balanced over an X-year period. Let's say it's 3-year period, 4-year period, and then...
But doesn't result in year 1 we didn't balance, year 2 we didn't balance, because we know in year 3 that's really where we're going to get tough and actually balance. So in year 3 you just don't balance either then, right?
That's a very fair point, and one way to deal with that is to only permit deficits that are caused by either emergencies or by changes in revenues due to recessions or other economic maladies.
Yeah. So there's a book written by former Democratic Mayor of Houston, Bill White, called America's Fiscal Constitution. Provides a good history of the fiscal history of the United States. He writes, long-term deficit reduction plans that push hard choices in the distant future are no substitute to balance the budget within several years. few pressing problems are best solved slowly over decades. Isn't that overall the problem as far as budget process reform, that we always want to push the tough issues till next election or sometime down the road, Doctor?
I agree 100% that we do tend to push difficult decisions down the road, and that's why we need rules to go into effect now that force us to start changing the programs. I would disagree very, very quickly. I would just disagree that moving slowly initially is a bad idea, in the sense that, let's say we overhaul Medicare. You don't want to tomorrow say,
right,
hey, we're going to change the system tomorrow, right? You want to build it,
put the law in
phase
place
it in.
today.
Yes.
So can we all agree on one thing, that you could have a budget system that actually could do harm? In other words, a budget process that actually encourages you to spend more than you take in, doesn't deal with deficits, doesn't deal with the socialism. Does everyone agree that you can actually have a system that actually does harm as far as trying to our overall goals? We all agree with that. Yeah? No? Does anybody disagree?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So if we can agree that you can have a system that actually does harm, I know Ms. Martin said that the solution is in not budget process reform. I would assume then that you could also agree that you could actually budget process reform that actually does improve the system. Now, Ms. Martin seemed to imply that we can't fix the system, that budget process reform is not the system, but everyone else seems to agree with us that you can actually come up with budget process reform that will improve our budgetary process and for the American taxpayer. Is that agreed to everyone except Ms. Martin?
Gentleman's time.
I think nodding of the heads is
Nodding
for the
of the
record.
heads.
Well, yes.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
One still head, so
Still head. Right.
gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for waiting until the end of the dais on some of us. I appreciate your being here. I've read all your testimony. I wanted to talk about, I think what you described, Mr. Posner, is the asymmetrical relationship we have between focus on mandatory, focus on discretionary. We hadn't talked about biennial budgeting today. We have a biennial budgeting bill that's here on Capitol Hill now. I think about 50 Democrats on there, a few more Republicans on there, but a bipartisan idea, certainly by today's standards, particularly bipartisan. Ms. Martin said it was the people that were the problem and not the process. So certainly if we have a problem with the people, it won't do any good to go to biennial budgeting, but it strikes me that we absolutely spend too much time talking about spending that's going to go away year after year, and not nearly enough time talking about systemic challenges. Tell me, I'll start with you, Dr. Primo. Do you see a benefit in biennial budgeting in terms of changing the relationship of Congress with the budgeting process, or is it either neutral or net negative for you?
Honestly, in the absence of a wholesale reform in the system, I think that biennial budgeting falls into the category of sort of a minor change to the system that I don't think is going to have a huge effect, because you still, even if you're not doing biennial budgeting, yeah, it frees up time, but there's no evidence to suggest that time's going to be spent reforming entitlements, let's say.
Are you reading Chairman Price's talking points? Because I think I've heard that out there. I think I've heard that before. Dr. Joyce?
I find myself quite sympathetic to the goals of biennial budgeting, but quite skeptical that they would actually be achieved. I think in an enterprise as complicated and large as the federal government, you're going to end up with huge supplementals in what's the off-budget year, which is going to make it look like a regular budget process. The other benefit that you supposedly would get is more oversight and more detailed oversight, and I agree that that would be a good thing. But you have to think about the incentives for doing that. I'm not sure the incentives exist right now for people to really sort of dig into programs and do that kind of oversight. So you know, if those things would actually come true, I think it would be a positive, but I'm not sure that they would.
Ms. Martin?
I would also say that other negative of biannual budgeting is in the agency where I oversaw the budget process, forecasting of some of our mandatory programs, which were the student aid programs. It's very difficult to do, and the longer the time period you expected us to do it, the more difficult it would be. So we had to look at things like student loan interest rates. It was difficult for us to do it on an annual basis. It would be doubly difficult on a biannual basis.
I want to come back to that as well. Mr. Posner?
Yeah, I certainly would echo everything that's been said here. I think we need to, there is oversight that actually takes place in the appropriations process. Those subcommittees and the clerks do drill down and hold those agencies to account for various things. We shouldn't underestimate that. Someone once said that thinking that the extra year is going to generate more oversight is like saying if we created a 25-hour day with the extra hour I would jog. So I'd say that's a highly uncertain proposition, much as I wish it happened.
You said earlier, Mr. Posner, that we ought to be focused disproportionately on R&D, human capital, and infrastructure, those things that pay a great rate of return. I agree with you, and I know the Pac-Man slide's been up a time or two of how we're not focused on those things. Candidly, I wish Mr. Ryan was still here. I think those are things that we agree on. I'd love to be spending there instead of on all of the maintenance programs that are going on today. But what I find is that in the system that we have, folks game that system around the 10-year window, sometimes around the 1-year window. But I also find when I talk to my friends who do what you do, they say, Rob, if you give me a 20-year window or a 30-year window or a 40-year window, I just get progressively worse. That gaming the 10-year window may be the best game we have. Can you tell me in just the limited time we have left about how to improve the process by changing the window, either narrowing it or widening it? Narrow, widen, or leave the same, Dr. Primo?
I think we need to widen, even as we understand, as you pointed out, that the longer the estimate, the more uncertainty there is with regard to the estimate. But I think that not thinking about 20, 30 years out is exactly what's gotten us into the mess that we're in right now.
Dr. Joyce?
I'm either benefited or harmed by the fact that I spent 5 years at CBO. So I understand that the desire for having a longer window, but I also understand that the further out you take that window, the more you're kind of moving from the nonfiction to the fiction section. And so that's difficult, I think.
Ms. Martin?
Yeah, based on my work with the folks who are deep into the models, 10 years seem to be where we should be.
Okay. Mr. Posner?
I would widen it, but perhaps for the 20, 30, 40 years, not ask for an estimate, but ask more for a qualitative yes, no. Pension smoothing is something, for example, that's used periodically, that let employers reduce their payments so that their taxes go up and then it bounces back after 10 years. Well, that's something, if CBO did that kind of analysis, I think that would ferret that out pretty quickly.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you so much. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
There we, oh, good. Just wanted to comment on something Congressman Brad said. I was a little disappointed in some of your responses as to whether a free market system is good or bad. I always feel it's good because it's moral and promotes freedom in general. I've been in elected office for 20 years, and one of the things that always hits me is that when you work for government, to a certain extent, you have to be very measured in your political opinions. Be it an environmental control agency, be an education agency. Again and again, when I talk to employees who work for the opposite of a free market system, in other words, the government, they have to give up a little bit of their freedom of thought, or at least what they say, to get along. It's also true when you have regulatory agencies. Earlier this morning, yesterday, one of my committees dealt with the Internal Revenue Service scandal. And I think inevitably, regulatory agencies, maybe look at one person with political views differently than another person. That's true of a variety of agencies. So what I'm saying is I think if you believe in freedom and freedom of thought and freedom of religion and everything, the less government, the better. But I'm going to my question deals with something Ms. Martin said, and I'd like somebody else to answer it. She said that sequester was a bad thing. Do any of you have any figures related to, say, the amount of debt each year, percent of GNP, or that sort of thing since sequester kicked in, as to whether that is a good or a bad thing? Yes, Mr. Posner.
I can't give you the figures right off the top, but basically, let's remember what sequester was designed to do when it started with Graham Rudman is not to be enforced, but to get Congress to do something else, to make that so odious that Congress would sit down together and deliberate on better choices. Nobody thinks that across-the-board cuts are the way to run a railroad or a government. And the way we did it this past time, I think in 2013, was even worse because we didn't let agencies plan. So it was kind of imposed with 9 months left. So that's not the way we want to do business. I think it didn't work out that way, unfortunately. And so I think there's lessons for that, which is, we have to make the sequester option truly odious to everybody, to give them the skin in the game to really sit down and do something else.
Dr. Joyce or Dr. Primo?
I think sequestration is a problem not because it requires cuts, but because it is itself an abdication of responsibility to make decisions about exactly where those cuts would be made. And I'm with Dr. Posner that it would be much better for the process to make a decision about more targeted cuts rather than automatic cuts, that its sequestration is sort of a leading indicator of the failure of the budget process to do its regular job.
I think the sequester points to the need for constitutional budget rules because we clearly see that when Congress tries to impose rules on itself, it doesn't always act in its own interest. So I think if you asked every member of Congress, would there have been a better way to achieve the same level of cuts in government spending through other means, they probably would all have thought of different ways to do it. And I should also note, just very quickly, everybody talks about the sequester in Congress as though it was imposed on you. It was voted on by the Congress. The Congress imposed the sequester on itself. And so to talk about it as though it was imposed on you from the outside, I think is just a little misleading. The sequester was a choice by Congress. And people can disagree, they might not have voted for it, but it was a choice by Congress. And if you don't like the way Congress engages in self-enforcement, then again, I would say this is why you need a constitutional budget rule.
Well, my good Republican witnesses, I'll give you a hint of the answer I was looking for. I can't think of anywhere we have to spend more money and anywhere that it's caused a crisis. But you hang around with a different crowd than me, I guess. One final question. You talked about a budget amendment. I'm going to wind up voting for a balanced budget amendment. But do you feel just doing something which is a lot easier to pass, get rid of the idea of mandatory spending so Congress has to vote on all this spending and all these rules every year would perhaps be a lot quicker way to wind up balancing things?
I think it would be useful if Congress started today acting as though we were under a constraint to balance budgets. Change the mentality that deficits are the norm and that balanced budgets are the norm. I think that would help a great deal.
Prior to the 1974 Budget Act, they used to call what's now called mandatory spending uncontrollable spending. And it's not uncontrollable. It's controllable anytime you want to sit down and take a look at it. So I think anything that would encourage an annual review of all spending in the budget would be a good thing.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Joyce, in recent years, Congress has increasingly failed to pass a budget resolution, and when it does pass a budget, it's often disconnected from the actual decisions on spending revenue that subsequently take place. What could be done to improve the impact of the budget resolution as a real plan for Congress to follow?
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind. The first is that I think a sort of more robust use of the reconciliation process, because it's really the reconciliation process that's supposed to connect the budget resolution to later decisions, and that's sometimes used and sometimes it is not. I think the second thing I would say is that I wrote a paper. It was quoted in Dr. Posner's statement and maybe even in my own. The suggestion of making the budget committees into leadership committees in the sense that I think more powerful budget committees are going to encourage more attention to the budget resolution, and that may start with who's actually on the committees.
Yeah, I took note of that during your oral testimony, and I think that's a great idea, particularly in the context of having the opportunity to take advantage of work, say, like the General Accountability Office, that I have just the summary page of their report that came out in March of this year, identifying areas of duplications, redundancies, inefficiencies, and looking at their last report from 2014, looks like Congress and the executive branches only addressed about 29% of the recommendations. Give me your thoughts on and this would go to any of you, Dr. Primo or Mr. Posner as well, on strengthening our ability to implement these reforms.
Without a doubt, I mean, I think sort of repetition in the budget in government programs and sort of waste in government programs exists. But I would caution against focusing limited attention on those issues, because in the terms of the federal budget, my perspective is that those are rounding errors compared with, again, going back to the slide that was up earlier, compared with the looming, entitlement crisis we face. So I think it's important to do, and I think that it's something that should be on the agenda, but I think first you need to deal with the longer term problems, because once you've done that, then you can start worrying about sort of tinkering at the margins, if you will.
My response to that would be that in the public view, this is real money, and there's, I think, a scriptural saying that if you're not faithful in the little things, how can you be faithful in the bigger? So I do think that we need to pay attention to that. In regard to the bigger items, I think you're absolutely right. That long term, that's where we've got to go. In regard to the budgeting, though, longer term, Dr. Primo, do you think it's time to shift to a 2-year budget?
My sense is that moving to a 2-year budget won't solve the larger problems we face unless that time that's spent not budgeting in a given year is spent dealing with long-term problems. So I think biennial budgeting in the absence of a larger wholesale reform just isn't going to accomplish what many of its proponents hope that it will.
Okay. And then the current budget framework is too short-sighted. It tends to focus primarily on the upcoming year. Again, going back to this, should Congress begin to implement targets, a multi-year budget plan with annual fiscal targets, or develop a specific credible plan to reduce the debt? Again, addressing a longer view on how to deal with the mandated spending. Dr. Joyce, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I think that's exactly the right approach. I think that focusing on just the next year is what's gotten us into this problem. And in fact, we don't even do annual budgeting very well. So I think that what we want to do is we want to develop a multi-year plan, a multi-year path, and then stick to it. I think that's all, as I suggested in my testimony, I think all the successful efforts that we have had to try to get deficits and debt under control start with a credible, agreed-upon multi-year plan, and then move on to how do we enforce that. And I think that's exactly what we ought to be doing now.
Falls under the context of sound public policy that you don't focus on a few people in the short term, but you focus on everyone in the long term. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you so much. Dr. Primo, Dr. Joyce, Ms. Martin, Mr. Posner, thank you so very much for joining us today and for your insights into a budget process and how we might be able to make this better going forward. Please be advised that members may submit additional written questions to be answered in writing, and that those questions and your answers will be made a part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. This hearing stands adjourned.